Thank you, David, for inviting me. So I'm a historian and philosopher of science, and I was sort of thinking about what could I contribute to this event because David invited me to talk. And I thought I would talk about this case study, which is how I came to know David, this historical manifestation of memory transfer and perhaps what we could learn about it when we're thinking about research that's pushing the boundaries or being disruptive or somehow getting outside of the box. We just sort of already heard that some of the history came up, but for those of you who don't know, memory transfer is largely associated with the work of James McConnell, at least initially. It's characterized, the phenomenon is characterized as the transfer of learned information, or perhaps at the time learned behavior, via the transfer of physical material from one organism to another. It was really brought to the forefront in 1961 and again in 1962 in a paper titled Memory Transfer Through Cannibalism in Planarians. McConnell had been working on this project more generally before this, but this is sort of where we'll pick up given the time I have to speak. It's important to recognize that this research program was considered by many to have largely collapsed within a decade or two of starting, with Barry Setlow here saying, these experiments drew so many people in and destroyed enough careers that there's a sense of embarrassment about the whole thing. Now, I don't know Barry Setlow, but I don't think he speaks just for himself here. He certainly doesn't speak for everyone. But I have encountered this as a way in which people sort of think of this whole historical episode with ridicule. I wrote about that history, and the joke I tell is the week my paper on the history of it was published, this paper here from David Glansman came out, and a colleague of mine sent me an email that had no text except in the subject, "You have more work to do." And I suddenly became very interested in how this sort of historical work I was focusing on and this sort of contemporary reappraisal and revival to some degree of McConnell's work, explicitly citing him in many cases. What was this to be told? What's going on here that could be investigated from the perspective of the history and philosophy of science? In exactly what happened in this history and what's myth and what's reality and what lessons can we learn from it? Now, I'm not here to tell scientists what to do. I've done some science, but I'm coming from the humanities. So I should point out that these lessons that I want to talk about are very much informed by my understanding of what many of you are doing, including David and Pamela and Mike Levin and a few others in the room. But I think they're worth making crystal clear, and I think they're worth making explicit in this attempt to push the boundaries and be disruptive. And that's that the memory transfer case does a very good job exemplifying the problem of having a distance, either inferential or evidential distance, between what researchers can be reasonably said to show with the studies that they do, and what researchers are either claimed to show by their community or they themselves claim to show to their community. And if this distance is too great or it's too unmotivated, sort of negative consequences can form, and I think this is part of the reason why the first wave of memory transfer collapsed by the end of the 1970s. So I'll talk about two of these lessons that exemplify this thesis today, and I'm happy to talk more about it. This is sort of an ongoing book project. Where I want to start with is with the actual experimental paradigm that McConnell introduced and the challenges that he faced almost immediately when he did so. So McConnell, reflecting on his 61 paradigm in 65, says, we trained some victim worms to criterion. This is an associative criterion, the association of light exposure and shock, a classical conditioning case. You get that criterion established, you then feed the worms to the starved, untrained cannibals, but don't worry, there's a control group of cannibals, so they certainly have both sides covered, and the results being clear-cut, the experimental cannibals that had ingested the trained worms, trained to criterion, were much better at the training task than those who had consumed the naive ones. McConnell presents this. This is really the research that blows the lid off and creates a cottage industry that is associated with the term memory transfer. He faced sort of three bundles of objections for this study. The first being issues with the experimental paradigm, and mostly issues with the association criterion. Bennett, who was a perennial skeptic of the memory transfer research that McConnell and later researchers did, constantly focused on the issue that we have not gotten a good establishment that the planarian association criterion is good and it works. And if you can't get that association on the table, then any sort of subsequent transfer is irrelevant. You have to do that first. This was an issue of reproducibility, and many researchers simply could not get this experimental paradigm to work because they could not establish that criterion. Along with that, several researchers claimed that there were confounding factors in the study. Most notably, Walker and Milton in '66 argued that McConnell did not adequately control for sensitization in his study, and that his results were attributable to sensitization rather than association. And this sort of undermines the kinds of claims McConnell claims he can make with his paradigm. Now, again, there's a focus here on sensitization versus association, and many of you might see where I'm going with this, but the key is that, as I've said a few times today already, a factor is only confounding if it's not what you're looking for, and the fact that they wouldn't focus on sensitization and felt they need to establish association is part of the issue. Because of the first two, there's a growing concern among several research groups, Furgenstad being one of them, that planarians simply cannot learn in a way that's of interest to the researchers, and that they should move into some sort of model organism or experimental animal where this is uncontroversial. This leads several research groups to move into rodent model organisms and largely abandon the planarian worm as the experimental organism for this research. They think this would be sort of solve the issues of 1 and 2, but they in fact end up reproducing, no pun intended, very similar issues in rodent organisms, and in fact that research ends up being quite problematic for a lot of additional reasons. I won't talk about that research here, but to recognize that many researchers wanted to go in that direction because they were again worried about the association. Can planarians really do this? The research program largely collapses in the face of the move into rodent model organisms and other model organisms collapsing and these concerns being levied at McConnell. This is largely thought to be right around 78, 79, everything really falls apart. Now, I will point out this collapse coincides with the rise of research on long-term potentiation. You have Bliss and Lomo in 1973, and then you have that research slowly gaining steam into 78, 79. I think there's a story to be told there, but I don't think it's the whole story, because as far as I know, and I wasn't there for it in person, LTP research doesn't really explode until the first half of the 80s in terms of the decade, with discoveries of stuff related to AMPA and NMDA receptors, with Lynch and others being involved. So this research was abandoned by most involved. It doesn't have a clear replacement. Some of the challenges, particularly the second challenge of confounding factors, was addressed by supporters at the time. I thank Sam Gershman for pointing this out to me. But by the time they move into the rodent model organisms, they've sort of abandoned any focus on the planarian worm. So what happened? I think a lot of things can be said about what happened in this case, but I think, especially for the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of thinking about this historically and what it might help those who want to push the boundaries do, is that McConnell and others certainly discovered something, and they discovered something non-trivial. They discovered that there was something being transferred of interest, and they thought it was a memory phenomenon. So they thought it had to be associative, because many of the researchers in the group were operating in this behaviorist tradition where association is a sort of sine qua non of memory, and that sensitization just doesn't meet the criterion that they want to use that term. Now, I noticed in Marshall's talk, he mentioned when people were talking about habituation, and is it really memory? I think the same sort of point is being made here. And I don't think this point has completely died amongst those who study memory. So one of the points that I want to make is that when researchers find something interesting, when interesting findings are brought to the table, these interesting findings are often pushed through the lens of how things are conceptualized. For example, what memory is. So if you say it's memory, I will assume, because I have a concept of memory that I'm operating with, that it has to have certain features, otherwise I don't want to call it memory. And I think this can result in too great of an inferential leap. I think this is what McConnell faced, and he didn't try to subvert or challenge the concept, which I think is what many of you in the room are doing now. You want to challenge what counts as a memory rather than just operate within a conceptual framework and then ultimately sort of problematize the interpretation of your research because of this. Now, I think this theme is important, and I hope making it salient could help the scientific community, but it's not the only one I want to talk about. The second, again, ties into my thesis, but it takes it in a different direction. This is about McConnell's sort of tendencies towards sensation. So this is from something called the Worm Runner's Digest via the American Psychological Association. I don't know if you can read that from down here, but it says, wanted for brazenly saying science can be fun, and wanted for unmercifully feeding facts to unaware subjects. I will leave you to figure out the multiple meanings of the second one, James V. McConnell. I'll explain what the Worm Runner's Digest is in a moment, but this will give you a flavor for it. So I never met McConnell, so unfortunately I was not able to conduct an interview with a lot of the people around him. But McConnell's secretary was interviewed shortly after McConnell's death, and the secretary said that Jim, as in James McConnell, wanted to shock people. He wanted to create controversy. He wanted to be controversial. He wanted to get people to sort of react strongly to what he said. He wanted to interest people, but in the end, he wound up alienating his colleagues. You can sort of see this in the very nature of the memory transfer paradigm. You can certainly see it in the way he talks about victims and cannibalism and things like that. And you can also see it in the way in which he decided to present his work. So McConnell started a journal, for lack of a better word, called the Worm Runner's Digest, where he included scientific publications, including the first iteration of memory transfer via cannibalism in planarian worms in 1961. People didn't know it was real. They thought it was a joke because his journal also included satirical articles and funny drawings, including the drawing that was at the very beginning of the talk. This on the right is something I recommend everyone try to find. I don't think it's in print anymore, but it's a compendium of some of the weird articles from the Worm Runner's Digest, including articles of the title, Nice People Don't Eat. So you can imagine if you're a researcher and someone presents you memory transfer via cannibalism in planarians, and I don't know if they were in the same article, but it was next to a paper called Nice People Don't Eat, you might be in a tough position to know whether you should take the former seriously. Eventually, this was sort of pseudo-resolved. There's more to say about this. It did sort of have several iterations, but it's important to recognize when this research, as in when the memory transfer research was being presented to the scientific community, it was initially in this context that it was being presented. McConnell's work, perhaps unsurprisingly, garnered some popular interest. This is from the Saturday Evening Post. This is by someone with the last name Bird. So to be clear, this is not McConnell's writing. Bird are pointing out that uneducated worms can acquire the wisdom of more intellectual ones by eating it. Sure. But the second part, I think, is where you see a sort of additional shift into sensationalism. This suggests a theory of knowledge which, avoiding outright cannibalism, might someday enable us to learn piano by taking a pill or take calculus by injection. Now, I really want to talk to as many people in this room as I can about how your work has been written up by people who aren't you in popular press, because you might all be saying, David, you can't hold what someone who isn't McConnell said against him. Certainly, this is some journalist that they're going to say what they need to say to sell the Saturday Evening Post in 1964. So I would love to hear all these stories, but I do want to point out that McConnell himself was very interested in popular science and popular press, and wrote several articles specifically about behavioral modification, or as we would now call it, mind control. His popular works include a paper called Psychoanalysis Must Go in Esquire. This is largely dealing with the sort of growing anti-psychiatry movement in the 1970s, sort of independent topic, but he was part of that, as well as Criminals Can Be Brainwashed Now in Psychology Today. So I have, needing to track down original copies of all of these articles, living in Germany, it's a bit difficult to find Esquires from the 1960s. But I do have pieces from Criminals Can Be Brainwashed Now that I think exemplify the points I want to make. So again, this is McConnell writing in 1970. Before you read what's on the screen, please keep in mind everything I said for the first theme is going on while this is being reported. Right? His work is being challenged on experimental grounds. There's a move into a different model organism. There are these issues of compounding factors. At this time, McConnell is publicly stating, I believe the day has come when we can gain almost absolute control over an individual's behavior. And there is no reason to believe you should have the right to refuse to acquire a new personality if your old one is antisocial. So not only is it a descriptive claim about the state of the science and its implications, there's sort of a normative claim that you shouldn't be able to resist this in any sort of reasonable way. And that's only if you're antisocial. I mean, I'm antisocial, and I don't think there shouldn't be a reason for me to do this. So it's important to recognize that this is all being stated in this context. McConnell is bringing out these issues. Some things I'm still trying to track down for this ongoing book project is there is good evidence, albeit defeasible evidence, to suggest McConnell is talking to the CIA while he is writing things like this. You can imagine the CIA in the late 60s, early 70s would be very interested in something like memory transfer and would perhaps be even more interested in something like mind control. Whether that actually happened and to the degree to which it happened is sort of, as you might imagine, difficult to find evidence of. And to be quite serious for a moment, this is also in the context in which a certain individual by the name of Ted Kaczynski, i.e. the Unabomber, is reading. Because he's also involved at the University of Michigan with McConnell, sort of in the 60s. Ted Kaczynski, i.e. the Unabomber, for those of you younger in this room, this was a terrorist who mailed packages to scientists. He did mail one to James McConnell. McConnell wasn't injured because McConnell made his research assistant open his mail. The research assistant thankfully got out of it unscathed after a few weeks in the hospital and is now doing okay. But that's to recognize that this is an individual within, at least partially within the scientific community, looking at James McConnell and his public-facing sensationalism and reacting in the sense in which he was sending packages that would kill people. This was before the Unabomber had killed anyone, but it was sort of the last case of that before that happened. So this is an important thing to sort of contextualize in the history of memory transfer. And this is sort of where I want to get into the second theme. I don't think the point I really am trying to make is one about intellectual humility. I don't think it's bad to be a sensationalist about your research, at least to a certain degree. But I think there's something interesting about the McConnell case, which is that the sensationalism he adopted muddled what he was really thought to be saying by his peers. And this left his peers in a tough situation to know what to say about what McConnell thought he was showing. Did McConnell think he was showing something about personality changes, and he was just being sort of sensational about the normativity of it? It becomes very clear, and a lot of the peers who had alienated weren't really able to understand what McConnell thought his research really showed, and where sort of that ended and the sensationalism began. All they had to operate on to interpret what he was saying was via the existing evidence that was coming out, which is growing and growing in terms of critical side to his McConnell's research, and their dominant definitions and concepts, which were largely incompatible with what McConnell was saying. Now, I will take a moment to say briefly, and this is again inspired particularly by the work of Pamela Leone and David Glanzman and Mike Levin, that I think there's an alternative here that I've sort of gleaned from many of you and tried to sort of write out for the philosophical community. And this is something I think McConnell didn't do, and it would have helped him quite a bit, which is that presenting a definition of something like memory or cognition does not need to equate to a commitment over what you think that is. You can treat definitions and concepts as conjectures that drive research rather than expressions that reflect what we already know. And the one thing McConnell never did was challenge what we think memory is or challenge the means by which we establish memory. And someone, who did this less than a decade later was Kandel. Kandel challenged the idea that we establish memory by a solely behaviorist criterion. He adopted a mechanistic perspective. Obviously, he was thought of a different mechanism than McConnell did, and he was operating with a different model organism. But this allowed Kandel to sort of talk about the relationship between sensitization and association. And in fact, again, thank you, Marshall, for actually flat out saying this in your thing. We can't deny the sort of advances Kandel made by adopting a different conceptual framework for how we establish memory and what we think memory is. And I think this is tied into, in part, that you can do this while expressing concerns about the limitations of existing definitions and concepts. This is the one thing, despite McConnell being a sensationalist, he never does. He never challenges the conceptual framework about what memory is or cognition is in this memory transfer research. So hopefully you find that helpful from this historical and philosophical perspective, that the memory transfer case, I think, exemplifies this worrying distance between what researchers show versus what they're claimed to show or themselves claim to show. And if this distance feels too great or too unmotivated, the peers and the scientific and popular community might react negatively. There is a number of ways in which this can be better motivated or this distance can be better explained, one of which is to challenge or at least bring into account the conceptual frameworks. Now, just to take a moment of self-promotion, and I don't have a cool image yet, sorry, I just didn't render it properly. I am running a workshop on the philosophical and historical dimensions of memory, and particularly unconventional memory, this 12th and 13th in Munich. I appreciate that the call for abstracts is somewhat soon, but I thought maybe some of you or your students would be interested, particularly if they're in the area. Please consider submitting or attending. I would love to invite you all, but I just don't have the money to pay for everyone's travel. But the AVH has given me some money to at least run this event, and I think it would be great if you could all come because I'm having a wonderful time at this event, and thank you very much.
So, David, really, really nice. I'd like to add something to your analysis. So I agree with two of your points, which I think are excellent. One is the definition of memory. At that time, psychologists had a very impoverished definition of memory. If it wasn't associative, most psychologists didn't consider it to be memory. And they also didn't consider invertebrates as organisms that could learn. I can't tell you how many grown-up neuroscientists I've talked to said invertebrates don't really learn anything. That even persists among neuroscientists today. The other thing you're absolutely right about is that McConnell was quite a sensationalist about his work, and you couldn't always tell when he was joking or when he was serious. The Worm Runner's Digest, which I first read when I was an undergraduate at Indiana University because it was in the library, if you read it from front to back, it was a scientific journal. If you turned it over and read it from back to front, it had all the jokes and cartoons. So I never read it from front to back. I always just turned it over and read it from back to front. But the final thing I want to say is I think one of the important things that you're missing, your analysis is missing, is what Gunther Sten has called scientific prematurity. So at the time McConnell came up with his experiments, there were two competing ideas about memory. One was the Cahalian idea, synaptic plasticity. The other was McConnell's idea, and it wasn't just McConnell who had this idea. Many people believed, because of the revolution in DNA, the discovery of the double helix, that maybe memory could be stored as a molecule. So there are many people besides McConnell who believe this. The problem is McConnell proposed that RNA was the memory transferring molecule, But at the time, the knowledge about RNA was so primitive, we didn't know about non-coding RNA. And so people who thought that maybe RNA is encoding memory thought that by analogy with DNA, it was in the base pairs of the RNA, which is almost certainly wrong. I mean, Hassam's going to talk about this, but that seems not very likely to me. So the strike against his work was, okay, so you say it's RNA, so tell us how. Okay, and nobody could do that. McConnell or none of the people who were working on memory transfer could do that. By contrast, the synaptic plasticity people were ready to go. Kandel, they had sharp electrodes. They could record from neurons. Kandel could measure synaptic plasticity. And so the technology and the knowledge was in place and ready to go for the synaptic plasticity model. And that's the model that has dominated until now. So I think that's one of the things that you have to include when you're looking at this reason why McConnell's stuff was. It wasn't just McConnell. There were other Rosenthal. There were really brilliant scientists who claimed to get memory transfer. It wasn't just McConnell, but eventually it died. It died, and I think part of the reason for that was that you couldn't come up with a mechanism by which the RNA or any other molecule could encode memory.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So there's sort of more lessons here about how we think about the involvement of the mechanism when sort of explaining the phenomenon that I addressed particularly in the more recent publication here, if anyone's interested. I do think it's interesting that while the people that eventually do the synaptic stuff come out on top, and of course the sort of persistent view that memory transfer was a complete and utter failure, certainly doesn't help people that are now trying to revive these issues. But even, I think you mentioned the name briefly. I mean, Rosenblatt, sort of a major post-Minsky individual. Yeah, a major person in neural network architecture analysis, was a strong supporter of memory transfer and actually adapted his neural network models to make sense of memory transfer. Now, clearly he thought it was somewhat molecular, but sort of like you and perhaps many other people in the room, you thought there was an interactive effect or maybe a level difference of levels of organization. So absolutely, there is a mechanistic story here, but it is ultimately quite complicated in part because the LTP research takes another decade to get really to the point at which this is the mainstream, what we think is the realizer of Hebb's postulate. But thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David, for your talk. Patrick Allard, Associate Professor here at UCLA. I was sort of struck by your talk and sort of connecting it to the two other talks and transitional epigenetic inheritance, which is a different kind of memory. And there was a recent piece, I guess a year ago now, in The Scientist that really pushed back about the possibility of having epigenetic memory in humans. And they really ignored what I would call weight of evidence, which is we've demonstrated in a bunch of other contexts. Therefore, it might be plausible in humans. It was really, I think, pushing human exceptionalism and saying it's not possible. And I think it's because it's probably pushing against a dogma or, again, human exceptionalism. Do you have evidence in your part of the story of parallels like this? It doesn't sound as pristine. It sounds like they were like experimental flaws as well, perhaps, but do you have also evidence of that really ignoring weight of evidence of an approach to science?
So ignoring the weight of evidence, there are certainly a lot of, once the things, for lack of a better word, start going downhill with memory transfer, there is certainly an ignoring of a weight of evidence from the planarian worm. Because the research that really suffers from experimental issues, particularly at the time, is the rodent research. And everyone just sort of forgets. And several people are, a small group of people are still publishing on the viability of that stuff. And just looking at citation differences, even from the 60s, it's an order of magnitude that people just stop paying attention to this attempt to control for confounding factors or attempt to precisify the associative criterion and things like that. That certainly sounds consistent with a kind of ignoring evidence because there is, and it's not quite the same of human exceptionalism, but this view that if we can just get to rodents, we have this sort of free ride to all of the mammalian things we want to say. We can get to humans via rodents. That's something that Freudenstadt says, if this thing is so general as to be found in mammals, we're good. We're all the way there. Not an exceptionalism point for humans, but certainly ignoring certain evidence because suddenly the road to humans has been opened up in a way that's far less controversial. Thank you for bringing that up.
We have one more question from the virtual. Yes.
Hi, yes. So, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh. So, yeah, one question from the chat is if more people had been able to reproduce the phenomenon, so this is kind of going back to the first theme, would the other objections have been less of an issue?
I mean, historical counterfactuals are always a little bit of a mess. It certainly doesn't help McConnell that his experimental paradigm is hard to reproduce. And it certainly doesn't help McConnell that real attempts to demonstrate association in planarian worms took from when McConnell was saying it in 61 into the 2000s, when you get stuff like Shamrat and Levin using a very complicated experimental paradigm, comparatively speaking, to get it off the ground. I think if you don't have the sort of fundamental reproducibility of your experimental paradigm on the table first, people lose faith fairly quickly. That's my speculation. But if it had been more reproducible, maybe they would have still complained about the planarians can't really learn. That could have been treated independently. So yes, in the bad way, in the sense that it definitely hurt. But if it had been there, it wouldn't have necessarily saved things.
Any last questions? Great. Well, I'd like to thank all our speakers for this.
Thank you all.